Good evening, everybody. This is the Colorado Pilots Association. My name is Michael Kaselniak. I'm the safety chair of the association. And tonight we're happy to present a CPA member, Cindy Carter. She'll be doing a review for the upcoming flying season covering non-towered airport operations and how they relate to safe flying practices. Cindy is a Pueblo, Colorado native with a little more than 3,500 hours total time and 2,500 hours instructor time. She moved to North Carolina in 1989, where she was able to instruct full-time. During that time, she taught a private pilot ground school for Asheville. I'm going to screw this one up. Buncombe? Asheville-Buncombe? All right, Technical College, and also worked as an ASI safety seminar presenter until 2018. Cindy holds ratings including single engine land, multi-engine land, up to her instructor rating, as well as her tailwheel endorsements. So with that, welcome, Cindy. Thank you for volunteering for a presentation tonight, and I'll turn the stage over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it. This was a seminar that ASI produced several years ago. So originally it was a 2-hour program, but we've cut it down so that we're not going to keep you 2 hours. You probably wouldn't be very happy with me if I did something like that. But with flyout season coming, it might be a really good idea to review a little bit about non-towered airports. So what we're going to do is we're first going to review a little bit about them, talk about communications and that type of thing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 different accidents that happened at non-towered airports. Any accident that takes a person's life is tragic, obviously. So we'll review these accidents with respect for the individuals involved and hopefully learn something from them. So Brian has got the chat figured out, and what we're going to do is hopefully he will facilitate chat for us if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make. First of all, I really appreciate Michael for the work that he does putting together putting together programs every month. That is a huge job. It's a big job, and I appreciate what he does. And Brian, I also appreciate Brian because he really helped me out trying to get all this technology stuff figured out. And like I said, he's going to facilitate the chat for us so that hopefully we'll be able to have a little bit of a conversation back and forth. When I was doing the in-person seminars, I felt that that was one of the best parts about them, is that we could have that conversation between the audience and the seminar presenter. And there's so much knowledge out there that you folks are you're awesome. So I really like having a little bit of a conversation back and forth. I did put my email address in here so that if anybody has questions or comments that they'd like to send later on, you can email me. So latest from the FAA.gov is that we have, well, this is a little old, like I told you, we actually have 5,082 public airports and 520 of them have towers. So with those numbers, it's pretty certain that we're going to be using a lot of non-towered airports. I don't particularly think that non-towered airports are dangerous, although some people have said they feel that way. Problem is that there is a little bit of a weaker safety net, because with a towered airport, we obviously have the air traffic controllers that share the responsibility of watching out for us and our passengers. So 91.103, as we all know, says that we are supposed to amass all the information available for any particular flight that we take. So that's going to include traffic pattern altitudes, pattern directions, could possibly include whether an airport has a calm wind designated runway. That's another issue that sometimes we kind of forget about, but it might be a good thing to check that type of information too. Of course, we have to look at frequencies. We have to look at special procedures. A lot of the airports around here have noise abatement procedures. So that's always a really good thing to look at too. Terrain constraints. One of the accidents that we're going to look at has a lot of terrain issues. And events. Sometimes the event information is not really available, and we have to dig for that a little bit. And of course, weather. Every place has got its own particular weather issues. And NOTAMs. Of course, we all know about having to check for NOTAMs, the TFRs, and all that type of information too. So 91.103 tells us that we do have to do that type of thing. This right here is just a little reminder. If you're going into non-towered airports, you might want to know which level of AWOS that you would be receiving there. This gives you a little bit of a reminder of, you know, the AWOS A, you're only going to get an altimeter setting. If you go on down the line a little bit, you're going to get a little bit more information. And that could be really important for you in a particular situation. So this was just a little reminder that I threw in. We need to remember that we need to expect the unexpected at non-towered airports. I'm sure that all of us have had a surprise or two. It does happen. There's always the poor or the non-communicators, people that non-towered airports, we don't have to have radios. So you don't have to have an airplane that even has a radio in it. And we've all experienced that type of thing. You're going to run into people that like to do larger patterns or smaller patterns, faster and slower aircraft. Those are going to be issues that we all are going to run into. And those who just aren't looking. I have run into a couple people who had to use their GPS to find the airport while they were in the traffic pattern. It's not really a good look. That is one of the places where we really need to be keeping our attention outside and not relying so much on a GPS. So communications at really any airport, but especially at non-towered airports, is very critical. We need to make sure that our transmissions are clear and concise. They're to the point. We get our message out, and we don't spend a whole lot of time trying to get that message out. I flew at an airport in North Carolina that was an absolutely wonderful airport. It was Rutherfordton. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that airport or not, but it was just over the ridge from Hendersonville, where I flew out of quite a bit. And it was long runway, instrument approaches, but because it was such a great airport with, by the way, a restaurant that could only seat 10 people, but it had the best cheeseburgers around. So because of all these great things about this airport, it attracted a lot of pilots. And it was a big mix of pilots too. Again, faster, slower airplanes, and also IFR students, IFR pilots, practicing approaches, student pilots, soloing, doing a lot of things. There was a big mix. And a few of the things that happened at that airport, fortunately, no accidents that I know of, but one of the things the locals would do was they would call position reports over to the McDonald's. Well, that's great if you're a local, but if you're a transient, you're not going to know where the McDonald's is. So that is not a really good way to be precise on your radio communications. Another issue was the IFR pilots. What they would do is they would make their position reports over the fixes. And that is great, but that doesn't tell a non-IFR pilot anything about where they are. So a suggestion that was made is that when they made the position report, that they also gave it in a distance from the end of the runway. So that kind of helped a little bit with the communications there. It was a beautiful airport and a great place to fly into. So the other side of the coin is also listening. Too many times, and I've seen this with so many students that I've flown with, that they are thinking about what they're going to say next to the point where they did not pay any attention to the communications they should have been listening to. So we have to remember that listening is also part of the job. And we can't always believe everything that is said on the radio, because the traffic pattern, of course, is fluid. You might be turning a left base turning left base for a particular runway when you make that call, but in just a few minutes, you're going to be turning final. So we have to remember that that is a fluid situation. Another one of the really difficult things for a new pilot or a student pilot to do is to get the mental picture as to what's going on all around the traffic pattern. Spotting traffic not at your altitude is kind of different. Anticipating where that traffic is going to be in a few minutes. These are all challenges that require a little bit of practice. And I would encourage my low time pilots to go to the airport, fly the pattern, get a little experience. It's always a good idea to take an instructor with you or another pilot that is very familiar, so that you got that extra pair of eyes and you can also get a little bit of information from those pilots. So do a little practice, and if you're a new pilot, and work on getting that mental picture. One of the things about airmanship is adapting to a situation. I like to describe airmanship, and I'm afraid that maybe my bar, I'm not sure if it's covering up the top of my screen there, but the way I like to describe airmanship is the ability to fly your airplane as second nature. Know how to change your frequencies without having to look. Know where your your flap handle is. Know your airplane well enough so that you almost know precisely what power setting it is you are using just by the sound of the airplane. This way, if you can fly the airplane in that condition, then you've got time to pay more attention to a short field takeoff or a short field landing, or what terrain constraints might be around. If it's a busy pattern, then it's great to be able to fly that way so that you can look for other traffic. Of course, at non-towered, we have got a big job of see and avoid. We want to be able to remember to look for problems. Practice defensive flying. Expect that the other guy doesn't see you and doesn't hear you. And be very, very careful, because the traffic pattern is no place for road rage. I've seen it a couple times. It's not a good look. It takes up precious time and energy that you should be expending flying the airplane. And we just have to remember that everybody makes mistakes, so we need to give people some grace. So we're going to get into the first accident that we're going to discuss. And this is the biggest issue on this accident was blind spots and blind spots and also communication. So this happened at Yellow Pine, and two aircraft collided, a Piper Arrow and a Piper Tripacer. Unfortunately, one passenger was killed, but both of the pilots did survive. So the circumstances was that this is an annual fly-in for this backcountry group. Both of the aircraft were inbound. They were on final approach. And most of the, excuse me, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. as you can see from this picture right here, it's a very confined area. It's a mountain valley. And so it can be a very challenging place to fly into. The aircraft, as I said, came together on final approach at the approach end to 17. And most of the debris was there at the approach end of 17, but there was some that was a little further away.
You know what? When Susan did. Yeah, anyway, there was no fire. Quarter mile from the runway. All the reports said a mile. It was 12 and something. Yeah, it's really sad. It's one of these things you almost want to cry. This is going to be ugly. Get out of the way. Oh my God!
So even though this was a non-towered airport, there was a recording made of the conversations. It was recorded inside one of the other aircraft. So it did show that both of the accident aircraft were self-announcing. So the next slide is going to be the Tri-Pacers pilot story.
We flew an upwind entry to runway 17, including a standard crosswind and downwind. As we announced and turned base, we saw a Cessna 170 on final initiate a go-around because of traffic that had not cleared the runway. We contacted the traffic on the runway and asked them to clear, which they did. We announced and turned final. I planned to land approximately 200 feet beyond the beginning of the runway in order to clear the runway as quickly as possible. Just as we crossed the river, someone, I believe on the ground, came over the radio shouting something to the effect that someone was too close. I immediately started to go around, but was struck by the other aircraft from above and behind.
And now the arrow.
I approached from the south, intending to fly a standard left-hand pattern. I turned base and final, announcing my positions, and noticed an aircraft still on the runway. Because I wasn't confident it would be off the runway when I touched down, I executed a go-around. After proceeding south for spacing, I turned back north and entered another extended downwind as before, announcing my position at several intervals. I entered the downwind at traffic pattern altitude, then entered a base leg, then final for landing on runway 17. I announced my positions on the CTAF and monitored the radio for the positions of other aircraft. No broadcast suggested an aircraft in front of me or on final while I was on final approach. I had the gear and full flaps extended and configured the aircraft and power settings for a stable 85 mph approach. The runway ahead of me was clear, as was the final approach path before me. As I continued on final, my aircraft collided with another aircraft below me. I did not see the other aircraft before the collision, though I was looking for other aircraft in the area and along my flight path. The other aircraft apparently flew a lower, closer in base to final pattern, cutting in front of me and below me on final.
Whew. I was afraid that it was get stuck again, Brian.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the probable cause. The aero pilot's failure to see and avoid the airplane ahead of his position and in the traffic pattern. But it says also that both of the pilots had failure to adequately monitor other aircraft position reports while in the pattern. So that's the probable cause. But let's look at some of the things that did lead up to this. Typically, the classic low wing overtakes the high wing. It's a blind spot that there's not much that we can do about it, except that we do have a few defensive things that we can do to kind of help with this situation. So we're going to look a little bit at the situation, the area. This is it's not just a busy cockpit type of situation, because now you've got the busy cockpit and you've got a whole lot of other things involved. A few things that you might want to know about the area is there's a lot of nearby terrain. I don't know if anybody has flown into this particular airport, but a few of the things that I learned is that high performance airplanes usually would keep going to the village of Yellow Pine. That's where the red arrow is, and then fly down a 4 or 5 mile final until they get to the airport. Another issue is that you cannot see the airport threshold until you're about a half of a mile out. Lower performance aircraft typically would do a 180 from the downwind to the final at this airport, and they would do that in what they called the bowl. So another one of those local pilot type of things. At this particular fly-in, there was typically about 125 airplanes. So a lot of traffic was going on the radio, and which obviously complicates things with a lot of traffic and terrain constraints. One thing I would like to mention too is that the aero pilot was getting instructed in mountain flying, and he had flown into this particular airport. So he probably felt at least a little comfortable flying in there. I doubt that he flew in there during one of these fly-ins, because that would be kind of crazy for an instructor to do something like that, I think. So here's a screenshot of the sectional chart. The red arrow shows where Yellow Pine is, and just south of that is the Johnson Creek Airport where this fly-in takes place. So that recording that I told you about, the final 2 minutes and 18 seconds, approximately 20 seconds of that was blocked, but the rest of it showed that there was 23 total transmissions, 10 different aircraft, 20 position reports. That's a lot of traffic going on, and a lot of traffic that you're trying to keep up with. That's one position report every 7 seconds. Another thing that kind of complicated matters a little bit is that in the pattern at the same time, there was a pacer and a tri-pacer and a Cessna 170 and a Cessna 172. So it was really pretty complicated trying to keep all of those aircraft separate, and knowing who was in close proximity to you could have been very challenging. So talking without communicating. This radio communications needs to be an active process. We need to trust but verify. And one of the things that you need to do that, of course, is trust that the person's telling you where they are, but also be outside the airport, outside the cockpit, trying to look for traffic, trying to spot that traffic where they say they are. And unfortunately, both of these pilots kind of stumbled in this respect. I have to give them a lot of grace, though, because this sounds like a really complicated situation. Lot of stuff going on, and besides being in very close contact with terrain. So let's talk a little bit about that, all the available information that we're supposed to get. On special events, is it really readily available? Are the organizers of the event putting information out there that we really need? So if you don't know, it's maybe a good idea to find somebody that does. Call the event organizers, ask them questions, maybe find somebody that's local so that they can give you a little bit more heads up. Maybe even tag along with somebody that knows, that has already been in there before. Another option, if it's a busy air show or a busy fly-in, fly to a nearby airport and pick up a rent-a-car and just save the stress of trying to deal with all that. So a few recommendations, and this is really, we all learn these kind of things from Private Pilot 101. Clear your blind spots, dip and lift your wing, radio between turns, do some shallow S turns. Make sure that you look above your airplane and also look below as much as possible. Obviously, in these positions, you got to kind of look around your wings a little bit, but make sure that you look above and below your airplane as much as possible. And of course, now we do have ADS-B that really helps us out, but be careful not to keep your head inside the cockpit too much. Another thing is to go away for a while. Sequence yourself back in again. Now, the Aero pilot did do this. He, on his, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but he did leave the pattern for a while and resequence himself back in, hoping, I guess, that it was probably a little less congested at the time that he did that. So this is the end of the first one. Brian, did anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to make about this before we go on into the next one?
The only question we had was where would we find the AWAS information, whether it was the sectional or supplement? I think it's the airport facilities directory.
You can find it on the airport facility directory. You can also find out what particular AWAS is at the airport that you're going into on the sectional chart. And then also approach plates, I think, gives you the AWAS level, the airport diagrams of the approach plates. So that's where you can find out what level of AWAS is at a particular airport.
Okay.
Okay. So this is our second accident that we're going to talk about. And it happened at Elizabethton, Tennessee. Now, this is a great airport. I have actually flown into this airport. It's close to the area that I was flying in Western North Carolina. It's not particularly, for all you mountain folks, it wouldn't be particularly challenging for you. The terrain, obviously, in Western North Carolina is not as high. We flew our traffic patterns at 3,000 feet. So the terrain is not as high. This airport really is a nice airport. There is area that you can use to make your climb before you do go over the terrain. Like I said, this airport was a really nice little airport. It had it didn't have a restaurant on the field, but it had a police cruiser, an old police cruiser that you could use to go into town and get lunch. So I always enjoyed flying over to this particular airport. The aircraft accident was a Cessna 172, and fortunately, everybody survived on this one. Now, here's a visual to kind of show you where the runway is and where the crash site is. It's in a forested area at 3,000 feet MSL. The airport elevation is 1,593 feet. So you can see from that in itself that the terrain rises very quickly. The pilot was 24 years old. He had a private certificate, had 90 hours total time, and this was a long cross country with passengers. His home base was in Ohio, so he might not have been real versed in flying in a little more difficult terrain. So I don't know I don't know exactly what his background was. Maybe he did get some experience, but he might also have not had much experience flying in a little challenging terrain. Flying in Western North Carolina in a lot of ways is like flying in Colorado. Obviously, the terrain is a lot higher here, a lot more rugged, but the terrain does create weather patterns and those type of things that is similar to Colorado. So now we're going to listen to the pilot's story here.
We were headed back to Ohio from South Carolina in a 172. I had about 10 hours in the airplane. I'd planned a fuel stop, but we were already en route when I found out that the FBO was closed, so I diverted to 0 Alpha 9. After refueling, I took off on runway 6 and departed on course via the left downwind. I didn't realize at the time that runway 6 had a right traffic pattern. I could see that I was headed toward terrain, but at least in the beginning it seemed like I was going to be able to climb over it. I was holding about a 500 foot per minute climb, but pretty soon it started to look like that wasn't enough. It seemed like the best thing to do was turn toward a small valley that seemed like it had less of a slope. But when I turned, the airplane lost lift, and even when I rolled out of the bank, it kept descending. I banked left to try to miss some trees, but we hit anyway. I realize now that I should have turned around instead of trying to fly up that valley.
So this is a diagram that the pilot drew of his flight and the way he went. And this is the diagram compared to a screenshot of the sectional chart. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you look under the magenta line, you can see that that area right there is at 3,000 feet. And just by looking at the whole sectional chart, you can see how quickly the terrain does rise right in that area. He did have a few other options, but not being familiar with the airport, and also because it was an unplanned stop for him, he might not have really paid attention to those. So like I said, why not wait a little further, maybe before he turned north, maybe go up the little valley that's right there a little bit before you try to turn north. So this is a picture looking west. Hopefully you can kind of see the airport down there. And you can see that there is a lot of area that he could have used to gain the altitude that he needed. He just was not familiar with the area. And it does state on the chart supplement that takeoff is right-hand traffic for that particular runway. And of course, if he would have done that, he would have been in lower terrain and been able to spiral up or even have enough time to gain a little bit more altitude. So his aircraft was 150 horsepower Cessna 172. Now that could have possibly done just fine in this area. The group that I flew with in Asheville, it was based out of Asheville. We had 4 aircraft. 2 of them were 172s and 2 of them were 182s. And the 172s were both retrofitted with 180 horsepower engines. Made it very nice, a lot easier to get over the terrain. The place that Asheville was situated in is it was in kind of a little bit of a valley. It had mountains to the west and also to the east, but you did have a lower area that you could come and go just south and to the east a little bit. So it helped to really have the 180 horsepower engine in those 172s. He also had 2 passengers along with him, luggage and fuel. This was a fuel stop for his route back to Ohio. And from the traffic pattern altitude that he was at, which I think you'll see pretty shortly, was 2,093 feet. It was only 1.8 nautical miles to that mountain. So he did not have much room to maneuver to gain the altitude that he needed. So I don't know if you can see, but it does say that the pilot's downwind leg pattern altitude was 2,093 feet. And so he did have to gain 900 feet in altitude to get over that. And he had to do that in a very short distance of just 1.8 nautical miles. So the probable cause, of course, was a delayed decision to maneuver around rising terrain, which resulted in a collision with trees and terrain, Contributing to the accident was the pilot's failure to calculate the performance requirements needed to climb over mountainous terrain before the flight. So a little bit of a final analysis on this is when you run into unforeseen events, that does add a little bit of risk to our flights. We're not prepared for it. We hadn't planned for that. And one of those things could be an unplanned fuel stop. So it's really easy to overlook the details. The details like the right pattern on the chart supplement. So it would have been a lot better if he would have noticed that the runway 6 was the right pattern. One of the things that we can also remember is to not rush things, to make sure that we take our time, especially if we've come into a situation that's unforeseen like this. We didn't plan on landing here, so let's take a little bit of extra time and make sure that we do have all that information. So a couple lessons learned here is, why in such a hurry? Why do we have to go GPS direct? From the way he drew his diagram, it does look like that's what he wanted to do, was go midfield downwind and then go directly west from that. So it's very tempting sometimes, but always a good idea to take a little extra time. One of the things we have to remember, and it kind of gets a little boring after you've flown for several years, is things like weight and balance and calculating our performance, the performance of the airplane. This accident here kind of demonstrates that calculating those performance data really can contribute to keeping you safe in the airplane. So that's the end of it. We're getting through this pretty quickly, I guess, because I'm used to doing this in person where I can get a whole lot more feedback and a lot more questions and comments. But Brian, does anybody have any comments or questions they want to ask about this particular accident?
Well, I was going to say, your comment about slowing down before you get to, wherever you're going to kind of prepare. I mean, that's why it's important to fly slow airplanes.
Good idea. I like slower airplanes. I can think faster than a slow airplane. So yes, and that's kind of a good thing.
It's my snarky little comment, but when I hear people trying to get a really fast airplane to go get their instrument rating or something, it's like, no.
Well, Brian, I think that's true. And so many times you see that people want to get their private pilot certificate in a Cirrus or something like that. I obviously, flying in Western North Carolina and flying with a lot of private pilots, I flew 152s. I've got a lot of hours in 152s, and they don't work here for obvious reasons, but it was a great airplane out there because it was slow. The student could think faster than what the airplane could fly. And another thing that I really enjoyed, one of the airports that I flew out of, it was Hendersonville, and it was a 3,000-foot runway. There was displaced thresholds at both ends, one because of a lot of very high trees at one end, and the other because of a road. And as I would fly with a student through the seasons, we might start out in the wintertime. And boy, that 152 could climb over those trees just as beautiful, not a problem. But then the warmer weather started setting in, and the student noticed they could actually see what density altitude was like and how it degraded performance. So there's something to be said about learning, especially learning to fly in an underpowered airplane. It could be a really good lesson there.
I agree.
So any other questions or comments that anybody wants to say?
I think we're good. We can continue to move on.
I'm sorry.
I think we're good.
Okay. Okay, so this is our third one and the last one for the evening. I don't know, I'm probably finishing way too early, but that, okay, so this particular accident happened in Lake Placid, New York, and it was a Mooney pilot, and unfortunately the pilot and both of the passengers were killed in this accident. The wreckage was contained on the airport in just a very small area. Excuse me. So it pretty much looks like it was a typical stall spin accident.
I heard a Mooney pilot request an airport advisory, so I answered that the winds were calm and there was no other reported traffic. The pilot said he was inbound for landing on runway 14. A little later, I heard the Mooney pilot say he saw another airplane. He was trying to talk to it, but getting no response. A bit later, I saw the other airplane. It was a Luscombe that's based here on the field. Later, I heard the Mooney pilot say he was on final for runway 14, but soon thereafter, I heard the airplane go to full power. I looked over and saw it pitching up steeply while banking hard to the right. It looked like an accident was going to happen right then, because it was only about 10 feet off the ground. That's when I saw the Luscombe, on final for landing from the opposite direction. Apparently, they saw each other at the same time and started climbing to their respective right sides of the runway. The Mooney made an angry-sounding radio call, but then seemed to calm down and said he'd follow the Luscombe in. As I watched, the Mooney flew down the runway and started a climbing left turn. I noticed that his landing gear was still down and he was climbing at a noticeably steeper than normal angle at a slow speed. Just then, I saw the nose drop. The plane went into a counterclockwise spin toward the ground. It didn't even make a complete turn before it went out of sight.
Okay, so we know the other airplane was a Luscombe. We know that they don't have electrical systems. So is there any ideas as to why maybe the Mooney did not hear the Luscombe? Well, possibly with radios, volume was turned down. As a flight instructor, I have to say I'm guilty for this, because so many times when I was working with a student and you had that radio going and maybe there was a lot of chatter, you know, you're just so tempted to turn that volume down so that you can talk to the student, so that you can give them a good lesson and not have to worry as much about the chatter that's on the radio. And like I said, I'm guilty, because there's been times when I've tried to head back to the airport and I forgot to turn the volume back up again. So maybe that was an issue. Maybe a wrong frequency. It's a good idea to always check the frequencies to see if we do have the correct frequency in. In the next video, you're going to hear the Luscombe's pilot story, and you're going to see that he does have a handheld that he would use. Maybe the batteries had run out. So there are a few reasons why it was possible that the Mooney did not hear the Luscombe.
I was piloting my 1946 Luscombe 8A. The aircraft does not have an electrical system, and the radio is a small battery-operated handheld. It delivers varying degrees of performance and reliability, and is sensitive to movement or jarring that can alter volume settings or cause other problems. It definitely encourages see and be seen flying. That morning, I flew to the nearby Adirondack Airport and changed the frequency to 123.0. I transmitted my position and intentions, but received no response. Later, I turned the radio back to 122.8, and it seemed to be operating properly, as it was receiving distant transmissions, though none were pertinent to Lake Placid Airport. On approach to Lake Placid, the radio was again quiet, and the traffic pattern seemed empty. I approached the airport from the north and overflew at midfield to check winds and scan traffic. The windsock indicated a very light wind favoring runway 32, and I transmitted my intention to land on 32. The midfield overflight is my preferred pattern entry since it provides an overhead view of the windsock, which is useful for a tailwheel aircraft, and it also alerts others of the presence of an old, slow airplane. I didn't observe any traffic. The radio was silent. I prepared for landing and flew the remaining legs of the pattern. Late during the turn from base to final, I detected some motion near the end of runway 14. After rolling out on final, I determined this to be an aircraft moving along runway 14. I aborted the approach and began a climbing right turn. There was roughly 1.25 miles between the two airplanes. I thought I heard a faint, unreadable transmission. I radioed that I was aborting the approach to 32 and entering the traffic pattern to land on runway 14. The radio was quiet. I entered the downwind leg and observed the Mooney in a shallow climb above runway 14. It was only later I realized he'd crashed.
So the Luskin pilot said that he was using a handheld. The picture, obviously, it had a little caption that said not the actual position. It was just a picture. But it's very easy for a radio like this to not give good reception or sensitive to jarring. So that could have been an issue. Now, this particular accident, I think, is really important to discuss because of some of the things that went on with it. The go around, for instance, it's a very critical part of a flight if you need to do a go around. You're at low altitude, low airspeed, high angle of attack, high drag. It's a very critical maneuver. From reading the witness statements and from what the video said, it sounds like the Mooney pilot was executing a go around from a pretty low altitude, and that he might not have been in complete control, because the witness did say, I thought an accident was going to happen right then. I don't know how close he was to the runway. I don't know if he could have possibly just landed from that position and hoped that the Luskin pilot would see him. And even if he didn't see him, go off into the weeds. That would have been much better than what happened, how this accident actually ended up. So that might have been a better choice to make. But of course, during the time, we can't say, well, this is what I would have done, because we weren't there. So it sounds like the pilot was a little unprepared. He was surprised that he saw this other aircraft landing in an opposite direction, because he hurried up and he left the gear down. Now, the flaps possibly were also down, but the NTSB report said that it was not conclusive. They couldn't tell from the wreckage whether the flaps were still down or not. So when that happens, obviously the aircraft doesn't want to climb, and a pilot is going to instinctively pull back to try to get the aircraft to climb. In any situation, we have to remember to fly the airplane first. It's also very important to practice go-arounds. Anytime that you have to execute a go-around, it's going to be unexpected. It's going to be one of those, oh gee, moments where it happens without you actually planning it. So that's also like emergencies. It's a really good thing to practice the go-arounds and practice emergencies in a comfortable situation with an instructor, so that it becomes second nature to you if you do have to use that maneuver. So this is the probable cause, the pilot's failure to maintain adequate airspeed. These are kind of formal probable causes, it sounds like, for the airplane's configuration and high profile, which resulted in exceeding the wing's critical angle of attack. So was the Mooney pilot solely at fault? I mean, some people would say, yes, the Luskin pilot was totally within his rights. to be at that airport without a radio or without a working radio. And that's very true. But it does sound like the Mooney pilot did overreact to the situation a little bit. He was probably rattled by all this happening, and it was close to the ground, and he wasn't expecting to see an airplane coming towards him. And he didn't handle the go around properly. So one of the things, like we were just talking a little bit ago, if you're comfortable with a particular maneuver or emergency procedure, you'll much less likely be to panic. And the only way to get comfortable with that is to practice these maneuvers. So practice these maneuvers so that you won't panic. Another thing that I kind of want to touch on a little bit is what he was, the witness said that there was an angry sounding comment on the radio. If he would have, it sounds like a little bit of road rage or air rage, whatever you want to say. If he would have taken that energy and used that to concentrate on the go around and concentrate on what he was doing, he might not have forgotten to pull the gear up and to also retract the flaps if that was even part of the situation, because like the NTSB said, it was inconclusive. They can't tell. Luscombe pilot really didn't help any, completely within his right to be without a radio. Radios are a little bit of a safety net so that you can keep track of what's going on. And maybe it would have just been better if he would have just gone ahead and landed from the position that he was at. Like I said earlier, I don't know how close he was to the runway and whether that was even a possibility. So a few lessons learned on this one. No radio, it happens. And we have to be aware that if we're flying into a non-towered airport, that there's very possible people flying out there that either just plain don't have radios or maybe don't communicate well, like we talked about a little earlier. And we can't assume that everybody's got a radio and everybody's communicating the way they should be. So again, we need to be keeping our attention outside the cockpit. Of course, now we've got the ADSB, and that sure does help a little bit, doesn't it? Go-arounds, we need to practice those kind of things. They're a very critical flight maneuver, and that's a very bad place to be rushing or to be panicking. So we do need to practice those things. And it might be a good idea to just go ahead and stay down. Now, I do want to make a little bit of a side note. I did have a situation very much like this happen to me. It was obviously didn't end up the same way, thank goodness. But I was flying out of, you probably laugh a little bit, is Transylvania County in Brevard, North Carolina. And I was coming in on one runway and somebody else came in on the other. We saw each other in plenty of time. We both turned to the right and there was no issues. One of the things I do now because of that situation is that I always try to remember to take a quick glance up the runway to the approach and the other side, so that I can see if maybe there's somebody coming that doesn't have a radio or that I missed the radio call. It's one of the things that I've learned to keep an eye out for traffic going the other direction. Also, you want to be careful or cautious, maybe find out if the airport that you're flying into does have a designated calm wind runway. In this particular accident, the Luscombe pilot said that the winds were slightly favoring the runway that he was landing on. So, and maybe if there, maybe the Mooney pilot thought that there was a calm wind runway. So those are just a few things that you might think about. And I'd like to thank you for participating tonight. And maybe I can get out of this and put my screen back over if anybody has any comments or questions that they want to ask. So
you should be able to just stop, yep, and then stop the sharing.
okay,
That's going to be in the top portion of the screen there.
there we go. Thanks, Brian.
Yep. All right.
Had
Brian is
So,
good at this.
yep. So we had Michael had some questions, and I apologize, I'm catching up. I just let you go. So on this last one, was the radio attached to the headset? That might be another. I mean, a connection is certainly an issue.
Yes, and that's a really good option. I don't know. I don't have that information, but that's a good option if you're going to be using a handheld like that, to have the connection to attach it to the headset.
Okay.
When I started training, I was training in Claremont, New Hampshire, in a Piper Tomahawk. And the first time I went up with the instructor, I just couldn't believe how loud it was. And the instructor was telling me, well, in the olden days, we used to fly these things, listen to the radio, and didn't have any headsets. And I'm like, how the heck did you guys know what was going on in the radio? Because nowadays, even some of the planes that I fly still have the microphone, you know, between down on the console. And it was just amazing that even if you had a handheld without a headset, I don't see how you could even hear what was going on because of the engine noise.
Yeah.
Well, you're familiar. That's why that's the tradition of cutting your shirt off, right? Because back in the day, before there were even headsets and there was no radios, the flight instructor sat behind the student, and the flight instructor would tug on the shirt the direction you needed to go, and that's how that worked. And
Really?
so
That's actually a story that I have heard. Another story that I have heard is that when the student flies solo for the first time, he's going to be sweating a lot. I don't know why we don't cut their armpits off. I don't know, but that they're going to be sweating a lot, and that's the portion of the shirt that they're going to be sweating on. So that, you know, I've heard a couple different stories about that. And I didn't get my first headsets until I was a flight instructor. So I did a lot of flying without headsets, and consequently now I'm kind of like, you know.
I was wondering,
go ahead.
one thing that Luscombe pilot, it sounded like they didn't know if their radio was working or not. That's something that around here, you don't hear people do radio checks very often.
We do.
And it's important.
That's not a bad thing to do, right?
Yeah. Just knowing, I mean, if you don't have a radio, that's one thing, but to not know whether you have one or not, that's even worse, you know, because then you're announcing to people and it's not working.
Right.
So
Well, you're relying on information or equipment that isn't working. So you might be not looking around as much if you think that you are communicating out there. So yes, you're right.
So I think, and Michael asked a really good question. As for the accident in the backcountry, are the fly-in organizers held responsible in any way?
Not that I know of. I did not see that on any of the information that I found.
Because when you said 120 airplanes, that's a lot of airplanes. And I would think the organizers would put together, like you see at other places, a small little ATC, and they keep track and talking to people, you know, on the ground and in the air and moving things along in a safe fashion.
Yes, yes. At Hendersonville, we used to do there's an air museum on the field, and we used to do what we called the air fair, and we would give airplane rides. And so there was 5 or 6 of us pilots that would take people up for a price, and then it all, of course, went to not to the airport, excuse me, to the museum. There was one weekend that I flew that, and in 2 days I did 32 takeoff and landings. And so there was a lot going on. And what we would do is we'd get one of the retired air traffic controllers, give him a handheld and say, here, keep track of all of us. And of course, because he was a retired air traffic controller, he did an excellent job of keeping us out of each other's hair. So never did have an incident. I actually did have one time when I was sitting at the end of the runway at that airport trying to taxi back because we didn't have any taxiways. We had to back taxi on the runway. And somebody came in and he landed too hot and too long and almost hit me. But he went into the weeds instead, thank goodness.
Oh, gosh.
So
Well,
what? Oh, go ahead.
On the first accident scenario, you talked about local landmarks. When I first moved here, I went up with an instructor and we were flying south of Parker. And we were coming into Centennial and the instructor said, well, let them know that you're 5 miles south of KOA. And I said, KOA? Oh yeah, I know that campground. And he looked at me strangely and I'm looking for a campground. And he goes, no, it's not a campground. I go, what do you mean? KOA is a campground. He goes, no, it's a tower. And I'm like, okay, that was my first introduction to a local landmark.
Yeah. That and it's great because like I used to always laugh when I heard people at Rutherford Ton saying, yeah, we're over the McDonald's. And I used to always laugh, but I thought, that is, if you get a transient pilot, they're going to be, oh, where the heck is the McDonald's? I don't know where you are. So,
Well, Erie's got that.
yeah.
I'm on the 45 over the Blue Water Tower inbound for 3-4.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't know where the Blue Water Tower is at,
then you're kind of lost. Yeah.
I think one of the things that Michael had suggested regarding turning the lights on once you're in the traffic pattern, that reminded me of a time that I went out to the Erie airport and the ceilings were high enough that you could do pattern work. It was very, very hazy. And there was a 172 in the pattern doing pattern work that was white.
Oh no.
With no lights on, and they were not making any radio communication.
Oh my.
Oh, I bet he was pretty darn hard to see.
Very hard to see. You could hear him and you could look up and kind of see the shadow going by. But I just thought, there's certain things as a pilot that are easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
And radio communications is just one of those things where it's like, hey, look, I can make radio broadcasts all day long. I can let you know upwind, crosswind, midfield, downwind, extended downwind, base, final,
whatever.
Simple to do.
Yeah. So that leads me to a question for all of you. Let's say you're in a position like that fly-in at Yellow Pine, and the radio is just crazy. If you're going to leave, I like to ask my students this type of question. If you're going to leave out a radio call, of course, I always, entering the downwind, turning base, turning final, clearing the runway. If you're going to leave out a radio call, which one would you leave out?
The upwind.
Okay. Well,
Or
let's
crosswind.
assume that you're just coming into land. You're entering downwind. My thought is that I would definitely not leave out the base to final call.
Yeah.
If I
You
had
need
to, yes.
you need one call that tells people exactly where you are. So like just saying downwind doesn't really help a lot. Like it would have to be midfield downwind or over departure end or whatever.
Absolutely. Because the
yeah.
downwind can be a huge area, right?
Right, like it's like a mile. So
Yeah. So yeah, I've always thought that if I was going to have to leave out a radio call, it would probably be the downwind to base call, because I'm gonna call base to final, and I do want to make a downwind call because that is a lot of area, and so if I had to, that would be the one that I would choose to leave out.
I think what's funny is I learned to fly in a non-towered airport, and I haven't had too much I didn't have too much problem transitioning to a towered airport, although I occasionally have this reaction where it's like I'm turning base to final and I go to, make an announcement like I'm in a non-towered airport. Fortunately, I catch myself most times. But I found that it was interesting of the people that learned to fly in towered airports going to non-towered airports, they had a lot of fear around it.
Mhm. Yes.
And I think, for me, one of the most beneficial things that I've ever done, and I hope they start doing it again, is the FAA would have, like TRACON would open up and have tours.
Yes.
Because when you are able to go sit in the control room with the ATC folks
Mhm.
and see their work environment, see what they're seeing, it changes your perspective of how you interact with them. Because now all of a sudden you've associated a person with on the other side.
Yes.
You know what they're looking at, you know what they see, you know what their expectations are. So I mean, there's just so many things out there like that pilots don't take advantage of. It was a huge educational opportunity for me.
I think you're absolutely correct, because I spent a lot of time taking students. I worked in Colorado Springs at a 141 flight school for a while, not as an instructor. That was before I got my instructor certificate. But I spent a lot of time taking students up to the tower for the instructors. And then when I did my private pilot ground school that I was teaching, that was one of the lessons. We always went up to the tower. Of course, it was easy for me. I was married to an air traffic controller. My husband was a controller,
Sure.
and so that was a really good. He was a really good resource for the students, because there was a lot of times that's true. They really need to know what goes on the other side of the mic, and then they might be a little bit more understanding. And I think too, with air traffic controllers, if they see these students parading in, it does get a little bit more personal.
Right.
These are people. They're not just an airplane out there flying. And these are people and they're trying to learn just as much as what anybody else is. So I think that's a great idea. I wish they would bring that back also.
Yeah, it's and I think the just the fear of talking on the microphone. I mean, I'm a cotton ball full of mouth sometimes, and when you're doing that radio broadcast, everybody on a frequency hears everything that you say. I just kind of got over it. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, if I can't communicate in the radio language of aviation, I'm just going to say it.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And that's what I would tell my students too, that, hey, just say what you want to say. Just try not to use full sentences.
Although one time I was on my way back from Scottsbluff, and center called up and was like, hey, how's the ride? And I called back and I was like, it's not too bad. It's we're, and I just had this big old long, strung out sentence that went on. And my flight instructor was sitting next to me. He goes, moderate, severe, and I'm just like, oh God, I wanted to jump out of the airplane.
Oh, I can imagine. I've got so many stories about radio communications. I had one student, poor guy. There was one guy at Asheville Airport that he spoke so fast that it was ridiculous. And we all know that my husband used to tease and say that they go to school to learn how to talk fast. And you wouldn't believe how many students said, really, you do? I said, no, he's joking with you. But this one particular guy talked so fast that my student, and a lot of times the controllers didn't know if I was in the airplane with them. Of course, they all knew that I was married to Bob, but they didn't know what airplane I'd be flying. And this student looked at me and he said, Cindy, I just can't get the ATIS. The guy's talking too fast and I can't pick it all up. And I said, okay, key the mic and tell him that you need the information because you can't pick it up. So he comes back and he says, Asheville Airport Information Alpha. You know, kind of snotty. And of course, I knew who he was. And after he went through that and my student got the information, I keyed the mic and I just said, "Thank you, Jack." And we went on our way. Well, when I got home, Bob said, "I hear what you did to Jack today." So, you know, but hey, I got my point across, right? You know,
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to. I did a flight from Centennial down to Pueblo and requested flight following, and some of the stuff the guy said so fast, and it was a Southern accent. That was even harder. And I had to tell the guy, "Could you please slow it down a little bit? Because I don't understand you." You know?
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure I was doing it right and I got the proper information for safety.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes we all have to remember those kind of lessons, you know, because I know that, I mean, I'm sure that there's times that I key the mic and I just go, you know, so we all have to be reminded from time to time.
Well, what's hard for me is sometimes, so one of the airplanes I fly is 5138 Romeo. And the taxiway is Romeo, or I'm sorry, the intersection's Romeo at Alpha at Metro. And God help me, and when I go out there and the weather is Romeo.
Oh.
5138 Romeo at Romeo 3 with Romeo.
Yeah.
Adrian knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That sounds like it's a mess.
Yeah, well, and I had a plane that was a whiskey, no, it was a Quebec Foxtrot. That's a hard set of syllables to put together. And when you're trying to communicate, and I think it was like 3 Quebec Foxtrot or Foxtrot Quebec or something like that. I just wanted to say 3QF, please.
I flew an airplane that was Bravo, Bravo. And there was a lot of times that the air traffic controllers just said BB. You know, I don't remember
really?
what the call sign was, but they would say BB. Yeah. Because it was so difficult to say Bravo, Bravo. Yeah.
Yeah. It's you know, I generally, the only time that think I've really been a little irked at air traffic controls at Centennial, and then Salt Lake City Center. I was requesting flight following and they just were like, "Sorry, we're too busy." And then like nothing for 20 minutes after that. I was just like, "Did you?" Okay, you're not that busy, but
yeah.
So
I think I'm getting pretty dark here.
you are.
Yes,
You're fading.
I'm fading into the darkness. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, especially Cindy. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I like seeing those live videos. They make you cringe a little bit, but I like the interaction of everybody involved. We can ask questions and stuff like that. That's the best part. We're doing a little bit of hangar flying tonight, which is really cool. That's a lot of fun.
That's
so
fun.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.